The Tea Act, the unexpected spark that ignited the American Revolution. Ever wondered what really started the American Revolution? It wasn't just about taxes or a single shot. Prepare to journey back in time and uncover the surprising truth behind the fight for American independence. We all know about Lexington and Concord, April 18, 1775, the shot heard around the world. This marked the start of the Revolutionary War, but it wasn't the cause. Think of it as the starting gun, not the reason for the race. The causes of the American Revolution are complex and multifaceted, rooted in decades of growing tension between Great Britain and its American colonies. Understanding these causes requires a deep dive into the political, economic, and social landscape of the 18th century. Taxation without representation was a powerful slogan, especially during the Stamp Act crisis of 1765, enacted March 22, 1765. The Stamp Act was a direct tax imposed by the British Parliament on the colonies, requiring them to pay a tax on printed materials. While the Stamp Act was deeply unpopular, it was repealed on March 18, 1766, after only 6 months due to colonial resistance. This was a decade before the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. So while significant, it wasn't the ultimate trigger. The real catalyst was the Tea Act of May 10, 1773. Surprisingly, this act lowered the price of tea in the colonies. But how could a price reduction lead to revolution? This is where the story gets interesting. The Tea Act was a strategic move by the British government to bail out the struggling East India Company, a vital component of the British economy. By granting the company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies and eliminating certain taxes, the British aimed to undercut colonial merchants and smugglers. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the first direct tax levied by Parliament on the colonists. It required a tax on all printed materials, from newspapers to legal documents. This act ignited widespread outrage and resistance throughout the colonies. The colonists argued that they should not be subjected to taxation without representation in Parliament. The Sons of Liberty, a secret organization formed to protest British policies, played a key role in organizing boycotts and protests against the Stamp Act. The Sons of Liberty emerged in 1765 in Boston and New York. Their origins are somewhat shrouded in mystery, but their impact is undeniable. They were masters of propaganda, organization, and at times, intimidation. Through tactics like mob rule, tar and feathering, and stockpiling arms, they effectively undermined British authority. They were the muscle behind the growing colonial resistance. The Sons of Liberty targeted Andrew Oliver, the official responsible for enforcing the Stamp Act in Massachusetts. They erected an effigy of Oliver, paraded it through the streets, and eventually ransacked his home. Ironically, Oliver himself wasn't a supporter of the Stamp Act. He was simply an easy target for colonial anger. He resigned his post and swore never to serve as a stamp master again. The Indemnity Act of 1767 was an attempt to save the British East India Company, which was losing money to smugglers. It was part of the Townshend Acts, a series of measures designed to raise revenue from the colonies. The East India Company was losing a staggering £400,000 per year to smugglers in Great Britain alone. The illicit tea trade was a major problem for the company and the British government. American colonists consumed an average of 2 to 3 cups of tea per day, totaling about £2 million annually. A staggering 90% of this tea was smuggled, avoiding British taxes. This widespread smuggling highlights the colonists' defiance of British trade policies and their willingness to engage in illegal activities to obtain goods at lower prices. The Tea Act of 1773 allowed the East India Company to ship tea directly to the colonies, cutting out British middlemen and reducing the overall cost. This made British tea cheaper than smuggled tea. Prior to the Tea Act, tea sold in the colonies was required to travel to Britain first for export, where it was taxed. Then, it was shipped to the colonies, where it was taxed again. The Tea Act allowed the tea to be shipped directly to the U.S., thus cutting the effective tax in half and lowering overall the consumer cost significantly. The Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, was a direct response to the Tea Act. Colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded British ships and dumped tea into Boston Harbor. This act of defiance was a turning point in the relationship between Britain and the colonies. It demonstrated the colonists' determination to resist British policies and their willingness to take drastic measures to protect their interests. Samuel Adams, a leader of the Sons of Liberty, organized the Boston Tea Party. He was closely associated with John Hancock, a wealthy shipping magnate and tea smuggler. Hancock's wealth, derived from smuggling, financed much of the early colonial resistance. He would later become president of the Continental Congress and the first signer of the Declaration of Independence. The Tea Act was the first domino that led to the American Revolution. By making British tea cheaper, it threatened the profits of smugglers like John Hancock and weakened colonial legislatures. The British East India Company had the British tea monopoly in the colonies and now also had a cheaper product. This combination of factors created a perfect storm of resentment and resistance. The Tea Act aimed to reform British tax policy, increase efficiency, and undercut the black market. The British hoped to recapitalize the East India Company and increase control over the colonies. The British Parliament hoped to both recapitalize the economically important British East India Company and increase the Crown's control over the colonies. Increased control because the Tea Act shifted the use of the existing colonial tea tax, which now was substantially reduced, to fund British expenses in the colonies. The Tea Act funded the salaries of royally appointed officials, making them more loyal to London than to the colonies. This further eroded the power of colonial legislatures. Governors' salaries were traditionally paid for by the colonial legislatures. By paying these officials directly from the Crown, although still with colonial money, the Sons of Liberty believed the local legislatures were weakened, as now their governorships were more loyal to London than their colonies. The Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams and funded by John Hancock, intimidated colonial merchants into refusing to accept the cheap tea. This prevented the tea from being offloaded and sold. This was very effective, and no colonial merchants would risk taking delivery of this legal and now inexpensive tea. The tea could not even be offloaded from the ships which brought it to the colonies. The Boston Tea Party was a direct result of the Tea Act. It was a protest against British policies and a defense of colonial economic interests. If the East India Company's legal tea was permitted to reach the colonies' market, it would undercut the lucrative black market enterprise of the Sons of Liberty's primary benefactor, John Hancock. In the past, Britain had backed down in the face of colonial protests, as with the Stamp Act. But the destruction of British property at the Boston Tea Party led to a new, harder stance. Previously, when the colonies stood up to the British Crown, like the demonstrations over the unpopular Stamp Act 1765, the Crown backed down and repealed the legislation quickly. The British Parliament responded with the Coercive Acts of 1774, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. These acts were designed to punish Massachusetts and assert British authority. The British Parliament would reconsider their long policy of appeasement to the colonies' mob eruptions and respond with the coercive acts. The colonies would call them the Intolerable Acts. Prime Minister Lord North defended the coercive acts, arguing that the colonists had defied British law and authority. He believed that a firm response was necessary to maintain control. On April 22, 1774, Prime Minister Lord North defended the coercive acts in the House of Commons, saying, "The Americans have tarred and feathered your subjects, plundered your merchants, burnt your ships, denied all obedience to your laws and authority. Yet so clement and so long forbearing has our conduct been, that it is incumbent on us now to take a different course. Whatever may be the consequences, we must risk something. If we do not, all is over." The coercive acts included Boston Port Act, closed Boston Harbor until the destroyed tea was paid for. Massachusetts Government Act, modified the Massachusetts Charter to end local participation in government. Administration of Justice Act, allowed British officials charged with crimes in the colonies to be tried in Britain. Quartering Act, allowed British troops to be quartered in private homes. Quebec Act, expanded the province of Quebec and removed territory from possible colonial jurisdiction. The colonial reaction to the Intolerable Acts was war. The acts galvanized colonial resistance and ultimately led to the Declaration of Independence. And the colonial reaction to the Intolerable Acts was war and eventually the Declaration of Independence. The American Revolution was not simply a spontaneous uprising, but rather the culmination of years of growing tension and conflict between Great Britain and its American colonies. Did you find this deep dive into the Tea Act fascinating? There's so much more to explore about the American Revolution. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment below, sharing what surprised you most about the Tea Act. Also, check out our other videos on early American history to expand your knowledge.